Now, so far we have seen how to look for the primary purpose question, answer, and how to eliminate the answer options when when we don't have the passage present. Now, that we have taken only as an example. Obviously, in the exam you will have a passage, and like I said earlier also, your answer should be guided by the information that is given in the passage. But what we have done earlier is only to show that we can come down to one or two answer options based on how we analyze the given answer options. Now, the given answer options that we have taken earlier appear to be similar in many ways, but then that would be the general focus of the answer options on the critical reading part of the reading comprehension, on the reading comprehension part of the critical reading on the SAT. Now, let's take a part of the passage and then see if we can derive the primary purpose. Now, what I have done here is I have just taken the first sentences of the given passage, and then we have formulated the question and answer options. Let's see how to analyze this. Now, let's say the first paragraph of the passage begins with something like, it's a rhetorical question. Where can freedom be found? Perhaps in a flock of birds. Now, if you see the first two lines of the first paragraph, there's a rhetorical question posed. Now, what do you think would be the continuation of the first paragraph? Obviously, this rhetorical question that is being posed would be substantiated. It would either be answered or it would be explained. Correct? So, that is the reason why I have taken just the first sentence of the first paragraph. Now, in the second paragraph, the second sentence begins like this. It says, once started, a wave travels through a flock at 70 birds a second. That means continuation. What are we talking about in the first paragraph? We are talking about birds. We are talking about freedom. We are talking about flock of birds. In the second paragraph, we are saying a wave travels through a flock at 70 birds a second. So the same idea is being continued. So what could be the last sentence of the first paragraph? Just for conjecture, the last sentence of the first paragraph obviously could handle something about the flock of birds, about freedom, and it could be about the formation of birds, because it says wave travels through 70 birds a second. So it could obviously be the formation of birds. Now, the third paragraph of the passage begins with, individuals cease to be individuals in many ways. Individuals, what does individuals mean here in this context? Is it still connected to this passage? That depends on the rest of the paragraph of para 3. Maybe it is talking about individuals in terms of people. Maybe it is talking about individuals in terms of birds. But we have just taken the first sentence of the third paragraph. So it says, individuals cease to be individuals in many ways. We'll come back to this in a while. Fourth paragraph, it says, we, meaning us, all have a sense of we. We all have a sense of we. That means it is talking about humans and their sense of identification. That is the reason why the fourth paragraph, first sentence, begins with, we all have a sense of we. So that means, what do we make of the third paragraph here? The reference to individuals, very often, or rather in this particular context, the reference to individuals is very clearly humans because of we. So that's how we establish the connectivity between the paragraphs. Now look at the fifth paragraph. It says, social psychologists find that we easily become prejudiced. This is the beginning of the fifth paragraph. And how does the fifth paragraph, which is also the last paragraph in this case, conclude? It says, thus we may be born alone, but we identify with a group. Now how does he conclude here? The author concludes by saying, we identify with a group. How do you connect this with the first paragraph? Flock of birds. Flock of birds also have a sense of identification, just like we also have a sense of identification. So what's the common thread running throughout all these paragraphs? Begins with freedom of birds, begins with freedom of birds, goes on to flock of birds, their formation, followed by how individual behavior can be related to that of birds, followed by the identification of us with ourselves or with a group, followed by what social psychologists think of it, and then concluding by saying, thus we may be born alone, but we identify with a group. That means we identify with a flock. We identify with our own flock. So what is the primary purpose here? It's very evident. It has to do something with identification with a group. Now, let's take a look at the question. The primary purpose is, look at the answer options. The primary purpose is to examine a problem. Do you think anywhere in any of these lines there is a problem mentioned? Does it say anywhere that there is a problem? Okay, you might say only the first sentence of every paragraph is given. How do we know if there's a problem given? If there's a problem given, like I have explained earlier, there would be a resolution of the conflict in the sense that there would be a solution to the problem that is mentioned. If you see the last sentence, it says, thus we may be born alone, but we identify with a group. This does not suggest any kind of solution of any sort. So obviously, it is not a problem at all. So we can eliminate this very safely because there is no problem mentioned. Take a look at the second option. Compare human behavior with bird behavior. Now, the very appearance of it looks very funny. How can you compare human behavior with that of a bird? It's very, very generalized, like we have discussed earlier. You can't compare human behavior with bird behavior. Now, you might say, we have started with birds, so we are drawing an analogy here, but only analogy in terms of identifying ourselves with a certain group. Just like birds identify themselves with a group, humans also identify themselves with a certain group. So if we are talking about groups, maybe there would be room for debate, but we are talking about behavior, then this probably cannot be really related to behavior of finding your own group. Probably not. So this can also be eliminated. To disprove a theory. How do you think this is different from option A? To disprove a theory, yes, there is a theory mentioned, just like we try to find an identification with a group. Birds try to find an identification with their own group. That is a theory, yes, but is there a disproving of the theory? There should be a disprove of the theory. Somewhere we should have some kind of contrasting idea mentioned in some paragraph somewhere. There is no contrasting idea mentioned anywhere. When there is no contrasting idea mentioned anywhere, it would be incorrect to say we are trying to refute or disprove. Now remember, this kind of phrasing of an answer option is very, very common on the reading comprehension. It's very, very attractive because it looks very logical. But in the given set of the lines that we have taken, it is not possible as an answer. To suggest an alternative, if an alternative is suggested, somewhere there should be a method, there should be a theory, there should be a conflict of the theory, and then there should be a method to resolve that theory, or there should be other theories that are mentioned. If there is more than one theory mentioned, if there is an indication somewhere that there is more than one theory mentioned, then we can say that it is an alternative. There is no problem, there is no solution, there is no mention of any kind of number of theories, so therefore alternatives cannot be possible. So it should be to analyze a phenomenon. What is the phenomenon here? The identification of birds with their own flock, then the identification of people with their own group. Though we are born alone, we have identified ourselves with our groups. So that is the phenomenon that we are mentioning. So it would be safe to say that analyze a phenomenon, because all this is explanatory. Analyze a phenomenon is appropriate as an answer option. Now if you look at the framing of the passage as such, take a look at paragraph 5. It says social psychologists. Para 5 begins with social psychologists. Now why do you think the author has mentioned social psychologists here? Whenever people are mentioned, whenever such kind of evidence is given, it is only to prove a particular point that the author is trying to make. an expert is mentioned to lend strength or to lend credibility to a particular theory or opinion that is offered by the author. So social psychologist here throws light on the fact that he is going to conclude the idea or strengthen his idea or strengthen his theory that we identify ourselves with a group. So therefore, it is only to analyze something. So to analyze a phenomenon. This would be the appropriate answer. So earlier we have taken primary purpose without a passage. Now what we have done is we have taken the first sentence of every paragraph that is given in one particular passage. This whole thing is one particular passage. What I have done is I have just taken the first sentence of every paragraph and the last sentence of the last paragraph. Now does this mean that it is possible to derive our primary purpose from the first sentence of every paragraph and the last sentence of the last paragraph? Perhaps, perhaps not. But it will at least give us a fairly rough idea as to what two answer options we need to keep and what we need to eliminate. So as you can see, it's very easy to narrow down to this particular answer option. Alright, so I hope you have understood how to tackle the main idea or primary purpose questions. Now let's take a look at how a primary purpose of the passage question can become narrow in focus, and they can ask you the primary purpose of a particular paragraph. But then obviously the paragraph is also in connection to the passage as a whole. So while we follow the same kind of strategy that we have utilized for the identification of the primary purpose of the passage, for identification of a particular paragraph, we can see how we can narrow down the answer options. Now, how does the question look like? Now, take a look here. It says, which of the following best describes the purpose of the fifth paragraph? So very clearly, this particular question is talking about the main idea or the primary purpose of the fifth paragraph. What it is not clearly asking is, how is the fifth paragraph connected to the rest of the passage as a whole? But in essence, that is the inherent meaning. We have to keep that in the background when we analyze this, because we are not looking at paragraph 5 in isolation. We are not looking at the primary purpose of a particular paragraph which is very different or which is totally cut off from the primary purpose of the passage. Alright, so what I have done here is I have just taken the first few words of every paragraph, and then we will see how to analyze this. Mind you, take a look at the wording that is given. First paragraph has a tantalizing paradox peers out from, and it can extend. The topic could be anything. It could be about science, because we assume that it is science, because in other paragraphs again you have mention of scientists, so it is safe to assume that the continuation of first paragraph is talking about some element related to science. So a tantalizing paradox. What is the meaning of a paradox? Obviously something that is in conflict is a paradox. So what can we make out of this particular word of the passage? From this particular word we can make out that there could be a mention of a problem somewhere, there could be a resolution of a problem, and there could be examples and counter-examples to prove the author's point. So a tantalizing paradox peers out from. The rest of the paragraph is, it could be anything. Next paragraph. All first year students learn that. That means whatever knowledge is being mentioned here, whatever paradox is being mentioned here, that is being related to the kind of information that could be relevant to first year students. First year students are basically people who are students who are just beginning in college. Now the third paragraph, one theory proposed by scientists. What are we talking about here? We are talking about a paradox. We have already assumed that the passage is about science, and we are talking about how students are supposed to interpret the paradox. And then the third paragraph says, one theory proposed by scientists. So obviously, whatever that paradox is being answered, it is being resolved and that is the reason why they say it is proposed by scientists. So whatever conflict or problem is being mentioned here, there could be one particular theory that is either explaining the problem, or there could be, in all probability, a solution given to the problem. Fourth paragraph, the scientist theory, however. So whatever theory is mentioned in the third paragraph, that is being contradicted. How do we know that this particular theory is being contradicted? Because the paragraph begins with the scientist theory and the contradiction element comes from the thought contraster, however. Alright, so while there could be a theory proposed to resolve the paradox, the paradox resolution is again debatable. That means the paradox remains as it is. That is quite possible. Yes. And then the next paragraph, that is the fifth paragraph, says later scientists. One theory, assuming this is the first theory, scientists explain that with a contrast, and then the scientists after that, later scientists, refined the theory. So whatever the problem is, if it is a problem, and whatever the theory proposed here, that theory is being refined. That means whatever problems have been envisaged here and here, those problems have probably been ironed out. This is the general idea that we get from here. Now, based on this idea, let's take a look at the answer options that are given. Now, the first option says, resolves a problem mentioned in the previous paragraph. Now here in the first paragraph we did mention that there is a problem. Obviously we know it is a problem simply because there is a paradox. And then we know the paradox is being handled, or rather there is a theory being proposed. The theory is proposed obviously in answer to the paradox. Why do we know that the theory is proposed in answer to the paradox? Because we are saying the theory is contradicted and then there is a refinement of that particular theory. You need to refine on a particular theory only when there is some kind of hope for it. Only when it is perceived as having some problems, but most of it can be used. So therefore, refined the theory, not completely replaced the theory. So it could resolve a problem. This could be one of the answers, because it is really talking about resolution, because refined equal to resolution. A problem equal to paradox. Problem can also be taken from here, because you need to refine the theory only when the theory is not complete on its own. So refined the theory, so therefore maybe there was a problem, maybe there is a resolution. Provides an example mentioned in the previous paragraph. It provides an example. From here we do not know whether there is an example or not. So from this particular line we do not know, so we at this point of time we'll keep this as an answer. Provides a counter example. Just like we do not know whether there is an example, we also do not know if there is a counter example. Let's take a look at D. Provide an example similar to the one previously mentioned. This also seems to be an answer. Very good. Provide a logical analysis for a claim. Later scientists refined the theory. Now whether that is logical analysis, whether it is a claim, it is definitely not a claim, because we are talking about a paradox in the previous paragraphs. So this we can safely remove. Now let's look at these four answer options which we thought were logical. It says an example mentioned in the previous paragraph. How is option B different from option D? Both are talking about an example. So in all probability, if option B is an answer, D also is an answer. So we can eliminate these two. Now what does this leave us with? It leaves us with A and C. What is the difference between A and C? In A, it is very clearly, very unambiguously stating that it is resolving a problem. So refined the theory. That is quite possible. Whereas here it says provides a counter example. Counter example in the sense an example to counter a particular theory. Whereas in this particular sentence, in fifth paragraph, we do not have any counter. It's only a continuation, because it says they refined the theory. Because it is a continuation and not a counter, we can remove this as an answer. So that leaves us with only option A as our very clear-cut, logically analyzed and correct answer. So resolves a problem that could have been mentioned in the previous paragraph. Now this part of it in previous paragraph is the common element in every question, in every of the answer options. Since the question is based on a particular paragraph, they will always try to connect it to the previous paragraph. So this need not be considered. What should be considered is these points: problem, example, counterexample, example, logical analysis. These are the words which will make or break your answer, which will help you decide whether a certain thing is an answer or not. So throughout, the same thread is continued where a problem is resolved. That's why it says later scientists refined. These two words, later and refined, these two words tell us that there is a resolution of a problem. I hope you have understood how to look at the primary purpose of the passage as a whole and primary purpose of a paragraph given individually in relation to the passage as such.